Yesterday, I posted a video where Deadmau5 talked about the pros and the cons of exposure. And I wanted to talk about this because this brings up a whole unique can of worms about basically, should you DJ for free as a musician, whether you're a hip hop artist, an electronic musician, a rock musician, whatever, should you perform for free? Is exposure worth it? This is going to be a very raw, unedited video, like a fireside chat style video. I do these a lot here and there, and I've been posting a lot of Deadmau5's videos because I really like his perspectives on things. And he said one statement in that video that I really resonate with, and that is exposure is kind of like an investment. And I think that's the best way to word it. So getting into like the nitty gritty and giving you the short answer then the long answer. My short answer when it comes to exposure or performing for free is to do it but not past a certain point. That's my short answer. Getting now into the long answer. When I first started getting into music and DJing and everything, there was one place near me, and this is actually a very kind of unique story that's very relevant to this exact topic, called Wonder Bar in Boston. Unfortunately, it did close down, but at the time, I met a bunch of people at Wonder Bar, and I said, hey, I want to perform and everything. And they said, well, we can have you open for some acts, but you have to perform for free. And as you can imagine, I was living in Boston, right? I had bills to pay. I had rent. I had utilities. I had to pay for food, just in general. However, looking back in hindsight, I'm really, really glad that I decided to DJ and perform for free. There's so much that you learn when you perform for free. I mean, all the things from just the psychology of reading a crowd and everything, to the technical aspects, of course, of performing, to even the stress of it, right? Like DJing in your bedroom, or like say if you have a jam band, performing in your garage, for example, is a whole different thing than you're doing it live in person. Another thing is the whole kind of engineering side of sound, right? I mean, sometimes you get there and there's no CDJs, so you bring a controller. Like sometimes there is CDJs, but let's say you're performing on, I don't know, like so you have like the biggest model of CDJs. You have the 3000s, but they have like say the 1000s going down in terms of the kind of like model of CDJs. That can be a different thing if maybe they have a different setup than you. There's so many different things. So I think performing for free, especially in the beginning, to get that exposure is very valuable. I know a lot of artists don't like to hear this. I think we've probably seen it too, some meme that was like, a musician is somebody who travels with $500 worth of equipment to spend $100 in gas driving for hours to make $50 from a gig, right? The idea that as a musician, we all know as you start out, you're pretty much a starving artist, not making any money, performing for free. I mean, there are even some situations, I was in one, which I will never do again, by the way, but I was in one situation one time where they wanted me to pay to play, and the way I'd make my money back is by selling tickets. And I remember, I think I lost like $50. I think it was actually, now that I think about it, maybe close to $100, where I lost money because I was trying to sell tickets. It was a really bad time night, and I was like, all right, I just have to eat the money. I'm like, wait, I'm paying to perform at this bar when they're getting people buying drinks and all this, right? So it does get very, very tricky, right? But when it comes to exposure, and I'd say in this case, really performing for free, I think it's really good in the beginning. However, there is a point though, and granted in that video, he does talk about things like the Super Bowl and the Grammys and how exposure is only good for like the few weeks before, the few weeks after, like say a big event. But in this case, we're talking about, let's say, a local bar, a local nightclub, a local venue where you can perform for free. There is a point though, if you start doing more and more shows, you get consistently booked for free, that you don't want to fall into, like, say, what I like to call the exposure zone. And this is something that I noticed looking back in hindsight. I'm not going to say any names or go too specific, but this is something that I noticed I fell into, and it's kind of like an odd trap. In a funny way, I know it's like a whole can of worms, but in a funny way, I kind of look at this similar to like the friend zone, how some guys say like, oh, like once he looks at you as just a friend, you're trapped in the friend zone and you can never leave. And granted, definitely a whole other subject for a whole other video, right? I know that's like debatable and whatnot. But when it comes to music, when it comes to the exposure zone, as I like to call it, that is definitely true. And this is something I kind of wish I knew getting into it, that at first, like I said, DJing and performing just for exposure is really, really good. It helps you hone your skills. In addition, the networking opportunities are amazing. I performed and opened for people like Xmag, who is Grammatic's band, for Future Primitive, who was actually one of my biggest musical influences when I first started making music. His style is super unique, like it's a blend of like tribal, psychedelic, and like electro. Super, super cool style. I networked and met so many people to the point where, you know, I've said this before in other videos, I'm not much of like a weed smoker. I don't judge anybody who does smoke. It's just not my thing. But I remember one time I was at an after party, ended up meeting Grammatic. I'm a huge fan of his. Got to like smoke a blunt with him and whatnot, which again, I'm not a smoker, but still, Grammatic's there, like, why not type thing. And I got to meet so many incredible artists. I got to network well. I got to understand the whole promotional scene through me performing at Wonder Bar. In addition, I also got to meet other people at other nightclubs around Boston and everything, to the point where there was one nightclub I got connected with that anytime they had a show, doesn't matter what it was, I got in for free and I got free drinks. How can you beat that, right? And this was all a result of me initially DJing for exposure. Another big thing, and I'm going to get back to the exposure zone in a second because I'm trying to give you the pros and the cons because it can get tricky very quickly, is Tim Ferriss, very famous entrepreneur and someone in the business world, talked about this. And I believe this is the same for DJing with exposure. That a lot of people, when it comes to the business world, for example, when they do a free job or like an unpaid internship or they volunteer or whatever, he talked about this with South by Southwest, which I've talked about in other videos, for example, a lot of them just don't do a big job. With him, he said, look, I'm going to take a volunteer position, a free position, an unpaid position or internship, but I'm going to kill it. And he said when he would do that, people would notice. Not only could he network and build connections and all this kind of stuff, but when he would do that, people would notice. And for me, when I would DJ, even if it was for free, right in the beginning, I would take it very seriously. I'd get there early. I'd meet all the bartenders, all the bouncers, all the promoters, all the other artists, right? And this was a huge way for me to really kind of break into the scene. Super, super valuable. However, though, now going back to what I just talked about, which is the exposure zone, there is a point, though, and I think in the beginning, at least this is what happened with me, I was reaching out to them, being like, hey, I want to perform at your event. Now, when it comes to Wonder Bar, back in the day, this is like 2012, 13, 14, 15-ish, around this time, every Wednesday, they had something called Wobble Wednesdays. It was the best event. One, because it was like in the middle of the week. It was a nice like break up to break up your week until the weekend. But also, two, everybody went every Wednesday. They brought in some pretty decent acts at Wonder Bar, this place in Boston, and I would go every Wednesday. Wobble Wednesdays, I could walk to there from my apartment. So I was like, every Wednesday I'm going to do Wobble Wednesdays. And so I started talking to them saying, hey, I want to open for some of the acts. So I reached out to them initially. And I think what can happen, and this is what happened with me, is it got to the point where they then started reaching out to me, which felt kind of cool, being like, hey, Mark, we have Wobble Wednesdays coming up this upcoming Wednesday. Again, of course, right? We have it every Wednesday. And we have this act coming in. We need an opener. We'd love for you to open. We can trust you. We've seen you perform. You know what you're doing, et cetera, right? There is a certain amount of trust. And that's why in the beginning, DJing for exposure, especially in the beginning of you reaching out to them, can be helpful because they're like, hey, they don't know if you're good. And I know a lot of people watching are saying, oh no, my band's great. I'm a great hip hop artist. I'm a great DJ. But everybody's going to say that. No one's going to say, I'm actually not that good, right? So that's a big thing for a lot of venues is the trust. Once they see you perform a couple times, then they'll eventually start reaching out to you. And that started happening. But then I got put, and things got really tricky at this point now, getting to the dark side of exposure. Is one, of course, I still wasn't getting paid, right? Like I mentioned, I was not getting paid. But two, it became kind of tricky, right? Where they started reaching out to me more and more and more. And I'm like, hey, I do appreciate that when I do perform, I get free drinks. That's kind of the standard thing. I get like free beers or free shots or whatever, right? But there's a certain point where I'm like, hey, shots and beers are not going to pay the bills. And so I was like, I'm like, hey, this is your third time reaching out to me to DJ, right? You're reaching out to me. I'm not reaching out to you. Is there any way I can get paid even $50, $100? And then what's weird is the difference, in my opinion, what I've noticed when it comes to DJing for exposure, the difference of going from like $0 or just free drinks basically to 50 is bigger than going from like say 50 to like say $300, right? The jump of not getting paid to getting paid is far bigger than the jump of getting paid 6 or 7 times that amount. Because in their mind now, they have to start thinking about things like payroll. They have to put it in the system. They then have to expect that every time you perform, they have to pay you. And it got to the point where it got kind of annoying and even borderline frustrating. Now, I'm not going to say any names. There are a couple of like notable figures looking back on it, but they were kind of known for this, right? Promoters, very, very bittersweet. I've dealt with a lot of promoters throughout my kind of history in the nightlife scene, especially as you can imagine, DJing and electronic music heavily tied into the nightlife scene, and I became friends and known a lot of promoters who do stuff in Vegas, just getting people into the club, but then also music promoters and promoting shows. Two kind of different types of promoters, and it got frustrating that I got put, like I said, in this exposure zone, where every single time I asked to get paid, they'd be like, all right, tonight we'll pay you. And then after I perform, they'd be like, hey man, sorry, like, we were over budget, or the bar didn't do well tonight, or I get some excuse to the point where I stop then DJing for them, right? I think there is a point, especially if you're DJing for exposure, that there's a certain point where I feel like you can almost like max out the benefits of that exposure, right? However, I think for a lot of musicians right now, and I've seen this, granted the economy, as we all know, and inflation, things are not doing the best financially, but I think for a lot of musicians, they do overlook the benefits of exposure. And like Tim Ferriss said, when it comes to the business world, I think this translates very well to the music world, even though they're two different things, is that a lot of musicians, in my opinion, also don't take it seriously, right? Like, I think in the beginning, DJing for exposure is one of the best things you can do, although it might seem like you're not getting paid. Yes, it doesn't pay the bills and everything, but like Deadmau5 said, it is an investment. I think that's the best way to word it. That I think even said in that stream as well. Obviously, I edited, the swear words, which is difficult to do, by the way, on the Deadmau5 streams. But one thing he said is like, look, he's like, maybe not initially it doesn't pay the bills, but eventually it will. And what happened is I ended up getting an agent in Boston through this whole networking process. I ended up getting invited to gigs and getting paid for them. And yeah, maybe in the beginning I was like DJing for free over and over again. A lot of my friends were like, hey Mark, you're not getting paid? Like, yeah, the free drinks are cool, but there's a point where it's like, I'm also not gonna get like smashed on a Wednesday. And of course, if I'm performing and everything, it's like, I don't want to wake, like there's a point where the free drinks can only be so beneficial or cool, if that's the right word, right? Where you're just like, okay, I actually need money, right? Like I actually need money, but it is an investment. And through that whole process, like I said, of me DJing for exposure, or basically DJing for free, it allowed me to network. I became friends with all the door guys. I went to almost every show. I met some of my favorite artists, and then I started networking with other venues, because as you can imagine, people who go to Wonder Bar, and use that as an example, but this is for any city, people who go to that like very local show, like here in LA, like kind of reminds me very similar. Every Tuesday, there's a production company called Space Yacht. They throw some of the biggest events in LA. Now they're everywhere. I think they're doing stuff in San Francisco, Vegas, Miami, everywhere. Space Yacht is now huge. And they still do something where every Tuesday here in LA, they have a show at Sound Nightclub. And it kind of reminds me of that like homey, connected feel, right, that I kind of got at the Wonder Bar when it comes to Wobble Wednesdays. Same thing with Space Yacht Tuesdays here in LA, that you start to meet people who go to every show. They are friends with another nightclub. You then go to that nightclub and you network, and one thing leads to another. And this all kind of resulted from, one, me performing for free, right? And I made sure that every set I would kill it. Every set I would kill it, to the point where I had people coming up to me saying, hey, when's your next show? Like, I actually came here for you, which is something I never experienced. And it was a really cool feeling. And then two, you start building all these connections because you can get into the venue for free. I think that's a very underrated thing as well. When you DJ for exposure, you can get into the venue for free. Even if it's sold out, you're getting in for free. I know that sounds kind of simple, but I think it's a very overlooked thing as well. Granted though, like I said, I think there is a certain point when it comes to exposure, as good as it is, I think in the beginning, and you kind of build up your repertoire, and addition is really good for your EPK or your electronic press kit, which is basically like a resume for an artist of prior shows. Do you have any videos of you performing, right? That's another big thing, that all these benefits when it comes to exposure, like say you bring one of your friends, you're DJing for free, it's a packed show and you're opening, you just say, hey, here's my iPhone, or use your iPhone, doesn't matter. Just get a bunch of videos of me DJing and killing it and doing all this kind of stuff or whatever. That's huge content for your Instagram, for your TikTok, for your YouTube, whatever. And also I want to say a side note, you don't need to hire like a cameraman or whatever. I film all my YouTube videos, like this one you're seeing now, with my iPhone. I've done full-length things with my iPhone, which is kind of crazy to say, but I say this not as a flex, but as like a good representation of this. Warner Brothers used one of my videos from Las Vegas in this huge documentary they did about Prince Harry and Meghan. And they asked me what, camera did I use? And I said, look, it was just my iPhone. And they said that my iPhone footage was better than anything they had, right? And this was like Warner Brothers and TMZ kind of partnering together to do this huge documentary. That is pretty awesome, right? So just so that's a quick side note, but these are all these different things you're going to get in terms of the benefits of DJing for exposure. But like I said, there is definitely a point that I think, like I said, the exposure zone, so to speak, that you do want to get a little bit cognizant of that and not get trapped into it. And I think that's a huge thing to kind of have this really good kind of understand that you say, okay, in the beginning, yes, I'm going to DJ for free. I'm going to reach out to them. Then it kind of flip-flops, like I said, they start reaching out to you. But there might be a certain point where they almost are taking advantage of you. And this is something that, looking back in hindsight, did kind of happen with me, if I have to be super transparent, where I'm like, they're reaching out to me a lot, which is great, almost every show, which feels pretty cool. But if there is a point where I'm like, hey, I've DJ'd twice this week, I'm asking them to get paid, I get excuse after excuse after excuse after excuse. And if you think about it, there does become a certain point where I think some venues, and not even the venues, but the promoters especially, once they realize they feel like they can take advantage of you, they're like, hey, we want this huge act to perform, but we have to, of course, pay them, right? We have to pay them in terms of their fees, their rider, whatever they have. Why not just have this guy DJ? That way we can save on money for the openers. We only have to hire one other opener, kind of the mid-act, and then we have the final act. And that way we have like 3 acts, one of them we don't pay. So the money we would have paid for them goes to another artist, as opposed to, let's say, if you came right in saying, hey, I'm a DJ, charge me, I'm just making this up, $300 to perform tonight, they immediately go into it knowing they have to pay you. So there is this kind of like trade-off, I think, where it is kind of unfortunate, like I said, with the exposure zone, that is very difficult to get out of once they kind of pigeonhole you as a free act. But I still think, looking back in hindsight, even though I'm not gonna lie, there was a couple moments where I'm like, all right, this is kind of messed up what this promoter is doing specifically. However, even looking back in hindsight, I would have still done the entire thing, because as unfortunate as that was, the whole DJing for free part led me up to getting more and more and more paid gigs. Ironically, even though I never got a paid gig from Wonderbar, like ever actually, it still allowed me to get paid gigs tons of other places from the connections I built, from people seeing me perform. They know I knew what I was doing up on the decks. They could trust me, which, like I said, is a big thing a lot of artists forget. I've seen some people go on the decks and bomb. The dance floor clears, the energy dies, people stop buying alcohol, the venue loses money, it's a whole thing. So trust is another big thing. But like I said, at the end of the day, I think when it comes to exposure, although there is that huge negative aspect of not getting paid and potentially, like I said, falling into the exposure zone, DJing for free, taking it seriously, or performing for free, taking it seriously, and going all out is a great way to then start getting those paid gigs.